Welcome to yet another episode of Shortcast Over Coffee. My guest today is Dr. Aruna Ramakrishnan. Aruna earned her PhD from the University of Minnesota and has an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering from IIT Bombay. She is the co-founder and CTO of the Boston-based startup Copernic Catalyst. Copernic Catalyst designs novel chemical catalysts to reduce the energy use and carbon footprint of bulk chemical reactions. This will be a two-part episode. Part one of this episode will unpack Aruna's journey from IIT Bombay to Exxon Mobil. Part two of this episode will cover her journey from big oil to a climate tech entrepreneur. I had a lovely time talking to Aruna and hope you guys enjoyed too. Let's get on with the episode. Hi, Aruna. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Bala. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, so I see that you did chemical engineering at IIT Bombay and a master's and PhD in chemical engineering from University of Minnesota. Tell me more about your background. What was your research on?
Well, I got into engineering I think really it was a fluke that I got into engineering. I was good academically, and it was just, engineering. I heard some people say that, girls shouldn't do engineering. And then I thought I should prove them wrong, I think. And then I gave the entrance test for IIT and got in. And then from then on, I enjoyed chemical engineering. It was a field that allowed me to bring together different kinds of disciplines. So if you were interested in biology, you could still do some biotech kind of stuff with a chemi background. If you're interested in more of computation, you could do that as well. So it was a nice it was a nice gray area kind of, where I could defer what I really wanted to do by doing chemical engineering, and that led me to research, because research again takes you to a place where you can answer all kinds of questions, satisfy your curiosity. I wasn't sure that I wanted to take up a job yet after I graduated, and so that kind of defaulted me towards research. In my master's and PhD, I focused on two different areas. I started out by doing purely experimental work. We were basically trying to figure out what kinds of materials would make good membranes, catalysts, things like that. And this was all towards industrial applications, right? So if I take a step back, I can explain what chemical engineering is. It is, a lot of people think it's chemistry, but it's actually not. There's a lot of mechanical engineering and just very fundamental math that goes into chemical engineering. It's something that allows you to do things at large scales. That's what chemical engineering is, right? Chemistry, you do things in the lab, you do things in test tubes, you discover. It's very fundamental, very science driven. And chemical engineering kind of takes the chemistry and makes it work at very large scales. And so when we for example, making polymers, or oil and gas is an example of something that's been around for a really long time as a way of providing energy to the world. All of these are really large scale problems. And so you really need the tools of engineering to make science work. And so chemical engineering allows you to do this, right? And in my research, I was looking at different ways to do things at large scales better. And then there's different, they're called, unit operations, like separations, or in a reaction, you bring molecules together. In separations, you separate out molecules. And different permutations and combinations of these kinds of processes allow you to make what the world needs. And so in the research that I was doing, I was looking at each of these little steps and trying to make each step better by using novel materials. That's what I did in my master's. And then in my PhD, I kind of realized, so again, I had a realization about myself that a lot of the experimental work that at least that I was doing at that time, it was purely experimental. So it was not guided by any sort of systematic thought or it was more intuition guided, I guess, learning from past experiments, but it was not, based on like a mathematical model or something that was very fundamental. And I realized that was something I was interested in. And so I started exploring that area. And for my PhD, I ended up doing computational fluid dynamics. And I actually was doing something very esoteric. It was called electrohydrodynamics, looking at how electric fields can drive liquids. But again, it had an industrial application. And University of Minnesota has a lot of ties with the industry. And so my PhD, I had ties with the coating and printing industry. They were interested in this kind of technology. But yeah, so it was all, solving interesting problems throughout my grad school, but with an eye on always having an application at the end of it. So it wasn't, it wasn't just doing science for the sake of science.
Yeah, you were saying how chemical engineering is different from chemistry, right? I think it's in general, like hardcore science versus applied science is a little different. Like how you have these PhDs in mathematics who solve really fundamental math problems versus applied mathematicians who find an application um, to that invention or discovery in this case rather. So we are talking about early 2000s or probably mid 2000s when you were in doing your bachelor's, right? What was the scene in chemical engineering like back in those days? And what did majority of actually, let's take a step back. What was the class size like? What was the ratio like,
Sure.
male to female? And what did people do after graduation? Did everyone go to research or industry?
Yeah, good questions. So obviously at the time, IITs, I think our batch, the entire engineering batch was about 500 to 600 kids, and we were in chemical engineering, we probably had about 80 or 90 in our class. The gender ratio was always bad. So when I joined in the hostel, I remember hostel 10, we had about 36 girls out of the 500, 500 to 600 total. But my chemical engineering class actually had a little more girls. We had about 10 or 11 girls out of 90. So it was not, it was bad, but it was not like I was the only girl. But I don't know, but somehow I just got numbed to, I guess, noticing gender related things because I had just been around, in an environment where I always was used to there being a low female to male ratio. So it wasn't anything that got in the way, really. It was quite fine. And actually, when I met my future husband in my class, and we got married many years later, but so that was another perk of going to IIT.
Yeah, I mean, it gets reminded me of one of Rahul Subramanian's joke. Here's your degree, here's your wife or spouse or whatever. But yeah, I mean, going back to what people did after graduation, what was the usual choice?
So a lot of people in the IITs, I think even today, unfortunately, they join under pressure that, somebody is putting pressure on them that they have to do engineering, they have to do IIT. Once you go to IIT, your life is set. That kind of mindset is very much there. It was there then. I think it is. Some people have grown out of that mindset today. I think but I think there's still a lot of pressure that kids face when they choose engineering. So I guess half the class wasn't really interested in engineering to begin with, and then people decide their discipline when they join IIT based on their all India rank. And so most of the chemical engineers in class were there because their rank put them in that discipline. And again, that compounds the problem, right? So you have a lot of people that are not really maybe as interested in the core subject, or they're not there because of that interest. At least they're there mostly because of the brand and because they want to leverage it to do something else, maybe do an MBA, or go do something else in the future. So I'd say that about more than half the class went into, became analysts, or they did things that were completely unrelated to chemical engineering but used their analytical skills. I'd say maybe another 20 to 30% of the class went into core chemical engineering jobs, and maybe about 10-15% went into research. So that was a split back then. And I think from what I'm hearing now, it's even worse today, with even fewer people going into core jobs. And but I hear there's a lot of interest in going into startups, or that ecosystem has changed a lot since I graduated. I graduated in 2008, and so I think people are being more bold now after their undergrad, and I see a lot more youngsters wanting to explore the startup space.
Yeah, I think the startup space in India has gone has gone bonkers, to be honest. I mean,
Mm.
I think from what I remember from when I did undergrad, I think Schlumberger or maybe Reliance, those companies used to recruit chemical engineers on a large scale, and like you said, most people would go on to do their MBA. But I think the critical thing is that while you are at IIT, doing your 4 years of engineering, you sort of develop a lot more skills, right? I mean, you develop management skills, you develop communication, and through the fests and whatnot. So college, teaches maybe a lot more things that eventually end up helping you. Chemical engineering also involves a lot of math, so maybe that also came in handy for a lot of people in future. Uh, but coming back to life after IIT, did you
Mhm.
always wanted to do a master's, or was that your goal, let's say at third year of IIT, or did it come sometime later?
Yeah. So I've always been the kind of person who has interest in too many different kinds of things, and sometimes finds it difficult to make a decision, because I don't want to let anything go. But I think that kind of led me towards research, because I always had a natural curiosity of trying to understand to a greater depth how things work. And I felt like my bachelor's had just given me a taste, and I really wanted to explore. And on a more personal side, I also wanted to explore the world, get out of India, look at how the world works, and get a first hand feel of staying with in different cultures. And um, America at the time, I think even now for a lot of people, it is a place which brings together a diverse mix of people from all over the world. And so for all of these reasons, I decided to go to grad school. And I chose University of Minnesota because it has a really good chemical engineering department. It has a big department with a lot of flexibility and options. And again, just from the point of view of wanting enough choice and wanting to be able to explore, that was a good fit. The research that I did was more microfluidics, so fluid flow on very small scales, and it was more laminar flow, and not really the large scale mixing and turbulent flows. Um, like I said, it had application towards coating and printing processes, which sounds it sounds the first time I heard about it, I thought, oh, that sounds kind of boring, like coating and printing. But then the more I read about it and I looked into it, it's super important how surfaces are at micro scales, because that influences their macro scale properties, the properties that we observe. And so that got me more and more interested in materials and how they work, materials engineering. um, so any kind of nanoscale flow, for example, I said coating, but also in printing, there is actually a boom in high throughput printing for the sake of printed electronics, or printing on flexible surfaces, and that kind of, at the time it was a new thing. It was not really I think since then, printing RFIDs and things like that has become pretty commonplace. But at the time, it was very important to get printing very accurate, because if you print with defects, it's okay for like a newspaper or something like that, but it's not okay if you want to print a circuit, right? So improving printing accuracy also requires a lot of materials engineering, for the actual ink that you print, the way that you print it. So there's materials angle and there's a process angle both to it. So I worked on both the material as well as the process in my grad school.
Yeah, interesting. You touch on so many different aspects while sticking to chemical engineering, right? I feel like, while you were doing your master's and PhD, you really did explore quite a few different fields. Now thinking about work after PhD, right? What do you want to do after PhD? You could go either the industry route or the postdoc route. Having had so many things in your plate, were you at any point sort of disoriented as to what do I really want to do, or were you really clear about what you wanted to
No,
do?
no, I was never clear. I was the most unclear person you could find probably in my department. But I think having all of these different experiences gave me an interesting tool set, and it made me because my master's and my PhD were so different, it made me a unique person from the sense that usually people do one thing and then they specialize, super specialize, and whenever you look at academics, that's how it usually goes. But having kind of a mishmash of different skills, I think it gave me it was a strength, and I didn't necessarily recognize it at the time. I felt like, I sometimes I would feel maybe I'm behind my peers, or why don't I have such a clear sense of where I want to go or what I want to do. But I just trusted my own instincts, and what I was looking for was definitely not to be too academic. I wanted to be applied and see my work kind of come to fruition. So I think that postdoc professor path was. I think I shut it off in my third year at PhD, third or fourth year in grad school. I said,
What was the reason behind it?
um, well, I think academics is a good field for the right kind of person. Um, so a couple of reasons, right? I observed different people in my peer group go down this path, and one thing is a lot of their time was spent in just grant writing and trying to get money to be able to do the work that they wanted. Then secondly, there's the pressure of tenure, of course, that you have to have a certain number of publications, or a certain quality of publications. So all of which is good, I think, for the university, but it also puts a lot of pressure, and reduces your flexibility in what you can do. So I think I really wanted to stay as flexible as I could, um, and stay as applied as I could. So these were the two reasons that.
Yeah, interesting revelation. Like, I have noticed people go down the academic path, and some of them share the route to professorship, and it is so difficult. Like you have to write so many documents, get so many referrals, and if you want to move to industry, you just create a resume and upload it on Workday or whatever the
Yeah,
platform is.
I think both paths have their own challenges. I think it's up to you to decide which set of challenges is more suited to you, right? So for some people, I know people that just don't dislike the idea of going into the corporate world completely, and they want to stay academic because they feel that's, it's a more, it's more pure, and it's more, they can, at least within their own world, they can do what they want. Um, so, I'm not saying that one is more or less challenging than the other, but I think when you're thinking of your own career, you really have to look inward and see what you're suited for, and not fool yourself. You have to understand your weaknesses and understand your strengths. And I quickly realized that my strengths don't play to the academic route.
You have worked in a few companies and have like close to 15 patents from what I understand. Tell me about your work experience. We'll get to the startup part later.
Sure. Actually, I should say one thing. When I was in grad school, I did want to test the waters a little bit. I did an industrial internship while I was a PhD student. And at the time, that was actually in my department, it was a very unconventional thing. People did not go off, take a break from the PhD to do an internship. And I did it twice. So, and I was fortunate to be blessed with a really good advisor who understood that it was something I needed. And interestingly, after that, the next few batches after me people started doing more and more industrial internships. So I kind of like that I started a trend. But through the internship, I learned that a sweet spot for me was actually early stage development. So bringing my research skills into an industrial setting and doing some of this technology development between, a very, it's not at the full scale, but it's also not at just the very early discovery stage. So kind of in the middle where you're scaling up a novel idea from like a test tube level to all the way to deployment. I found that was it's an underappreciated idea, an underappreciated space, because a lot of ideas fail in this space. It's almost like a valley of death. The scientists are very, there's thousands of ideas that scientists are very excited about. There's papers in Nature and Science and all kinds of magazines that look very good when you read them, but if you look at it through an engineering lens, you can quickly tell which ideas have the potential to be scaled up and which ideas don't. And I feel that that kind of an input at an early stage of research can really help to bring the right ideas up quickly, so that you're not stuck churning your wheels on ideas that may not have a future. And that early stage application kind of a lens, looking at things through a scale-up lens and an applied lens, that can benefit early stage researchers as well. So that's what I discovered when I did my internships, and I realized that that's the kind of space where I wanted to be, at least initially, out of my PhD. And so after my PhD, I joined a company called Praxair, which no longer exists. It was actually taken over by Linde, which is a large gas company. You might have heard of it. But in that company, I was doing this kind of early stage development work. So not really full-blown engineering, but lots of engineering with some science in it, kind of a mix of both. And there I was working on things like making hydrogen, and I was learning about how things are done at large scales. I was involved in an actual greenfield, which means actually putting together steel on the ground and putting together a plant on the ground. Now, this was not something I'd done before, because as a chemical engineer, I was just a paper engineer. I just had I just solved equations and done things on paper at IIT, and then I did research after that. So this was my first real experience with executing and solving real world problems. And so that was super useful. I did that a couple of years, and then I stayed in the same field, but I moved companies. I went from Praxair to Exxon Mobil. And Exxon Mobil, as people know, is this big oil, right? Big, large scale oil and gas, basically providing energy, different forms of energy and different forms of chemicals.
That's what they love to be called now, energy company. And
Yes, yes. Everyone's rebranded as energy now, right? Nobody likes to say oil. It's become a dirty word. It's not necessarily a dirty word, but we can discuss.
Yeah, I mean, it has powered the world for, I don't know, like 150 years. So
yeah. So, but at ExxonMobil too, I was working mostly on emissions mitigation technologies. So I think the world was realizing that, obviously we cannot live on oil and gas forever, or at least cannot continue to do things the way that we have in this with hydrocarbons fueling everything. So ExxonMobil had areas like biofuels, carbon capture, carbon-free hydrogen, things like that, where I worked. And it was, again, a lot of materials development and process development. And that's where I spent the next, I guess, 5 years of my career. And towards the end of my career, the last year, I also spent in strategy and planning. So by that point, I'd been an advanced researcher, senior researcher, and I got pulled into strategy and planning because I guess partly because of my interest in low emissions and trying to see how the company should go, right? There's different paths where the company could go. There was a lot of talk in the company about increasing the focus on lower carbon solutions. And I think so my interest kind of matched with where the company was going. And I did a 1-year stint there in strategy and planning, with that as my focus area. So I was planning advisor. I could advise the VP of research as to what the company should be working on, what kinds of problems make sense to solve. I like that role a lot because it helped me to bring my perspective and my intrinsic desire to make an impact on the carbon reduction, emissions reduction. It allowed me to marry that with where the company was going. So that was an interesting experience. It was a foray out of day-to-day technical role into something that was more forward-looking, right? Strategy.
How I know about Praxair is, I went to undergrad at NIT Jamshedpur, and then there were, I mean, it was an industrial area, and there were these, huge chimneys with Praxair label on them.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I didn't know that they were bought by Linde. You touched upon the fact that you love being part of that process where you know a prototype, or I mean prototype in a general engineering sense, but prototype usually comes to fruition by scaling it up, right? I think Elon Musk always says this, like it's so easy to build a prototype, but the difficulty comes in mass manufacturing, and he always talks about this when he talks about Tesla and how difficult it was. People have ideas are cheap, but it's just so difficult, and especially the car industry is so
Yeah.
competitive, more than competitive. It's like this eclectic, group of
Mhm.
people, and it was so difficult for him to break into that. So great. So you were part of the, were you in Woodland, Houston, with Exxon Mobil? They have a
No,
huge research.
yeah, I visited Woodlands a bunch, but my main office was in New Jersey. So I was living in
Oh,
New
the
Jersey.
one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
went from Minnesota to Buffalo. That's Tonawanda, actually, in upstate New York. That's where Praxair's headquarters was, for the technology headquarters. And then I went to New Jersey. And Exxon at the time had a pretty large site, about 1,000 employees, and all focused on R&D. But we used to work closely with the Houston site. That was the main head office.
Yeah, I think Houston, Jersey, and Bangalore were sort of the big research centers for Exxon.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think I just want to touch on this whole oil and gas thing. Like I worked with oil and gas for a brief bit, and the point you say about being resistant to change is way more in oil and gas than any other
Mhm.
field, because uh, I think the stake is huge, and after the BP oil spill, people are more resistant to taking risks, and they are like, hey, this works, so why not just keep doing it? So that's one thing that I've noted personally,
Yeah,
with respect to oil.
and the stakes are high. You're absolutely right in terms of, even you think of how much capital these companies have invested in the ground. Look at, if you've gone and looked at a refinery, you'll see, anybody who's seen a refinery will know what I'm talking about. You have they're massive, right? There's sprawling campuses with massive reactors and massive separation distillation towers and all kinds of equipment in there. And each of these refineries is like a multi-billion investment. And to completely change away from that, it's, so if you're in software or doing IT or something like that, it's easier to pivot. You can be a lot more agile. But when you're in this kind of sector which has so much capital on the ground, it's very difficult to completely change from one technology form to the other. And here it becomes more important to think about how can you repurpose what you already have on the ground, right? Not let it go to waste. And these kinds of ideas can really bring practical solutions. So instead of going and saying that, oh, everyone has to change to sun and wind and throw away all of these multi-billion-dollar assets, that's not going to fly. And or that's a very hard mountain
Sell.
to climb.
Yeah.
You've got to think of how you can form a bridge, right? And forming that bridge is critical to making anything work and to deploying solutions. um, and so there's many ways to do that, and we can talk about that. But like you said, the stakes are really high, and this is one of the biggest reasons why anything in this chemicals, oil and gas, this large scale, anything that's large scale and involves hardware takes time to change.